welcome back to the Essentials. I'm Chase Johnston Lynch, and I'm joined once again by my good friend and partner, Dan Hopper. What's up, Dan?
Hey, hey, Chase, what's up? Good to see you.
All right, all right. So I would like to say that, we're going to make a shout out right up at the top to someone who has watched the show and had given us a point of contact for our next discussion. So I'd like to give a shout out to Lucy Pickavance, who suggested that we look at 70s crime thrillers, in that kind of genre event. So hopefully the topics that we chosen today will be within that revenue that she was suggesting. I myself am a 70s kid, so of course I love these films and this genre and everything. And, we're going to get right into it. But before we do, I just wanted to kind of preface it with the kind of like the world construction view of the 70s in that time in America, where we have been coming out of war films. Vietnam films are starting to rise because that was a big prevalent war that we were going through at that moment of time in the 70s to 75. But also the Western. So the Western was old hat to us, So we always had the lone gunfighter, going in to save the town. One man can make a difference and everything. But obviously, that was going on in our city streets, our New York grind, gritty streets, where real cops were making real inroads. And so that led to real hard-boiled characters and stuff like that reminded us of the Pulp Fiction, of the detective novels, Mickey Spillane and stuff. So we're going to go and hit those guys, right? And I believe, should we start with Steve
Bullitt.
McQueen and Bullitt, because
Yeah.
that was 68.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
So
Sure.
hit us off with some Steve McQueen facts there, my man.
Well, I think before we do that, I just think you bring up something very important about the origins of where like these characters came from, right? So I think there was
Mm-hmm.
always a history in film of like, the authority figure that was also the anti-hero, who was
Yeah,
anti-authority to an extent, who was always
yeah,
sort of bucking the system. So I think
yeah,
that goes all the way back to like the 1930s and those Warner Brother films, like with James Cagney and Jimmy and Humphrey Bogart.
yeah. Humphrey
And if you
Bogart,
and
definitely.
and if you want to sort of trace the how it all got inspired, then like Kurosawa sort of did those films, like the Seven Samurai, uh,
Yojimbo, yeah,
Yojimbo and Sanjuro, and those inspired and became like the man with no name, Clint Eastwood, and sort of right, and then it sort of you see sort of the direct art, sort of line all the way through these three movies we're doing, which is Bullitt, Dirty Harry, and The French Connection,
yeah.
because all these three characters, while they're all police officers, they're also kind of bucking the system. They're
And
frustrated
they're
with the
like
system.
lone gunfighters. They're on their own. They're not. These
Exactly.
weren't the cop films. That was the Strike Force team that came about in the 80s. In the 80s, we got a lot more of the Strike Force team.
Right.
But in the 70s, it was more the lone gunman.
And this wasn't Dragnet. Dragnet was very by the book.
Definitely not
Just
Dragnet.
the fact. Yeah, this is the opposite of Dragnet.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
it's interesting, like when you think about Steve McQueen. I think he sort of had established that kind of anti-hero character already in the Magnificent Seven, and then especially in The Great Escape. You
yeah.
know,
The Cooler King. Yeah,
yeah, the Cooler King. And there's always thing about Steve McQueen, which I always found fascinating, is like he literally was one of the coolest characters to ever exist on screen. But
hmm
if you kind of look at him, like if you take him like his physicality, right? He
hmm
seems like a guy that like if you walked into a bar, he'd be at the end of a bar like drinking a beer and watching a ball game, and you wouldn't pay that much attention to if he wasn't a famous guy. You know what I
yeah.
mean?
He had a very everyman quality to himself. He didn't really look like a movie star, superstar, but
Exactly.
he exuded a certain confidence, and that was how he was off camera, and he brought that on camera, and
Exactly.
it made him like kind of like an asshole, really. It made him kind of like unlikable to his coworkers, but he believed in who he was, and that bravado came across on screen. I mean, like you could take it from the poster itself. that poster where he's actually in that, that black mock net with the gun strapped around his shoulder and his arm up. It's just like, my God, who wouldn't want to be that guy?
Exactly. And I probably of like all three actors, what we're talking about today, McQueen and Clint Eastwood and Gene Hackman, McQueen probably was the closest to that guy. Where Clint Eastwood was not that guy. I mean, Clint Eastwood's a soft-spoken man. If you've seen him in interviews, you know what I mean?
Yeah. But I mean, I will break Clint Eastwood down because I mean, there's a lot to Clint to break down. But I mean, and being that he's kind of like, even though Gene Hackman, I believe, is still alive now. I mean, Clint Eastwood is still working.
Well, yeah, that's amazing. At night,
he's still man. Old. You know what I mean?
But back to Bullitt, it was interesting. The Steve McQueen character and the Clint Eastwood character were both based on the same guy named David Toshi, who was a chief investigator for the San Francisco Police Department, and he was the lead on the Zodiac case.
Wow! I did not know.
Mm-hmm. And that case, which is still to this day never been solved. I mean, there's a lot of possibilities, and they think maybe it's this person, that person, but they've never really totally come out and said, we found who the person was. And also if you really want to get into the minutia of like trivia, Tosh Station on Tatooine in Star Wars, George Lucas named it after this particular guy, David Toshi.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah. But I think besides Steve McQueen, the most iconic thing in that movie is their car.
The Mustang.
The Mustang. Yeah, the Mustang, 68 Mustang Fastback.
Who didn't want one? Yeah.
they had two of them. And one of them was recently found a couple of years ago and restored, and it sold this past January for $3.7 million in auction.
Whoa. That is awesome.
That's crazy, huh?
Yeah, no. I mean, do you have any ins and outs on the major car chase of that film, the San Francisco Hill car chase? Because I mean, I want to move on from that to something else. But I mean, what do you have about that?
Well, the car chase was, they say, like online from beginning to end, was about 11 minutes long in the film. It, depending on what source you go online, it took anywhere from 3 to 5 weeks to shoot.
Yes.
And what's really amazing about that scene is when you watch it, there is that great score by Lalo Schifrin until they really get into it, and then the music stops, and it's just all audio. It's like sound effects.
Wow.
And the sound, right? Remember, and the sound effects just like and the visuals just take over.
Yeah.
Now,
would you say, because this is 68, would you say that this is one of the first films that gave us the major trope of the fruit cart? You know what the fruit cart trope is? Yeah,
I remember.
Like,
I was thinking about that the other night.
Chase, you have to hit a fruit cart.
Right.
Do you think this was the first film that did that? I mean, you might not have to, but I mean, it sounds like it probably could be.
Probably, yeah. I mean, I think this is like, I think anybody can sort of point to the chase scene in Bullitt that is just the first sort of contemporary car chase scene in, film history. There have been plenty of other car chase scenes, but the way, like, this is the model that everybody followed from that point on. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I guarantee you that if you were going to be in, like, any room where directors getting together with, like, their team and the cinematographer and their stunt coordinators or whatever, even up to this day, they're watching that scene, Well,
yeah, because it's always got to be, this is the scene, like, we always talk behind the scenes. This is a scene where it's obviously, directed by the second unit director, who is usually the stunt coordinator, right? Mm-hmm. It is well plotted out, well storyboarded, so when you said they're sitting around the rooms, they're obviously sitting around talking about, okay, so what obstacles can we put into his path? There are the nuns walking across the street, or there are the fruit cart, or
a cable car, or whatever it is.
Yeah, something to break through, and everything else like that. And that became the trope. That became like, we have to figure out how many stunts we're going to put into here, and how many obstacles. Now,
right.
also too is
Oh, sorry to interrupt, but like what I was going to say, also like you can look at the Fast and Furious and any of those movies,
Yeah.
and like everything comes from that
Yeah, that's
scene.
what I mean. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to say. It's like the commonality of like when you're doing filmmaking, and I think a lot of people don't realize this about filmmaking. Like that's why you don't get like short films that are short action films. Action films have to be planned, and like what you just said, this was like 11 minutes. Sometimes they're like 5, or sometimes they're even longer. But it takes weeks or to film and to get that 11 minutes. So we're not realizing like, oh, okay, shoot, stop, get a close up of this, get a close up of that. Even just putting your hand on the accelerator, what am I? Stick shift, putting your hands on the stick shift, and all of those elements are shot over a long period of time, and they are pieced together. It's like shooting animation, and
Sure.
so what I'm just trying to say is that what I was saying before, I think that like Bullitt, which I thought is Peter Yates was the director or something like that.
Yeah, Peter Yates, and if you remember when we were growing up in the '80s, like he directed that. I loved it as a kid. I haven't seen it since, but he directed Krull. Remember Krull?
Yes, I love Krull. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, we are going to have to do Sword and Sorcery, but I love Krull.
Yes, from the
and
'80s.
everything like that. Yeah, and but what I was going to say was, I think that I was saying Bullitt quintessential action inspired Peter Bogdanovich's What's Up Doc with Barbara Streisand and Ryan O'Neal, because they had a classic car chase down the San Francisco hills, right? And it was very much kind of like inspired by Bullitt, I feel, but it had all of it, but it took it more to the comic
I think it was also kind of
realm.
spoofing it a little bit, you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
that's what I mean. They took it's satirizing or comic way of looking at it. So it's just fantastic, looking at that and thinking about, oh yeah, yeah. And I had to make sure because that was 72 and Bullitt being 68. Yeah, obviously, But these it's just fantastic looking at Bullitt and looking at that as a way of looking at action sequences, because so many, like you just said, are inspired from it. But you also wanted to point out too. Oh no, that was on the other film. Maybe we'll talk about that on that First Connection about locations and stuff. But this was down the San Francisco hills. But most of the time when we're looking at car chases, they're taking place in multiple places and they're edited together. So we'll get to that when we get to the other film.
And the other thing, I think connection between these three films is that they're all almost all location shoots. You know what I mean? Whether the two in San Francisco or French Connection, New York.
Yeah, and where the location is a character.
Location becomes a character, and also by like the late '60s, early '70s, the cameras became much smaller, and they were also influenced by all those European films and documentaries. So a lot of these films are sort of done in a kind of especially French Connection, are done like in that kind of quasi documentary style. A lot of handheld camera and stuff like that.
Yeah.
If you went back 10 years before, those traditional studio films, they would never make films like this. They didn't know how to make films like this.
Well, no, because they had big 70 millimeter. They had the big Araflexes and stuff like that. Right. So these cameras were huge, and I mean, I don't think they really got smaller too much later. But I mean, maybe they were pulling out some small cameras as third and fourth cameras and everything to be able to shoot those action sequences. And everything, sometimes you got to put a camera in a crash box in a car.
Right, but they probably, what they did in a lot of those and I would assume in Bullitt and French Connection especially, what they probably did is they probably took a 35 millimeter body, stripped it down, and put a 400-foot mag on. For those who remember film, right? You got 400 feet, you got 4 minutes. So
yeah.
So it's like they rolled for 4 minutes, and you hope you got something great, right?
Oh, wait a minute. Hold on, bro. It was 11 minutes, wasn't it?
That's for a 1,000-foot mag.
Oh, okay.
So you got to do, in a car, you might not be able to put that whole mag because it's this big, where a 400-foot mag might be this big. And
got it.
It's like they have it, unless you stick it out half out the window or how you ever rig it on a car.
Yeah.
But today it's interesting too to today, that stuff is old hat. They've been doing it for decades, but I would imagine that how they film these sequences and rig all these cars, they probably were making it up on the spot because they really hadn't done those kind of sequences before. You know?
Well, no. If you try to go back before '68, there wasn't many car flipping stunts. Because the '70s, that's when you had like the Dar Robinsons and with the Burt Reynolds type of films happening and everything. Like Hooper is fantastic for looking at the behind the scenes of stunt making and all of that and everything. But anyway, so let's like so that was McQueen, and everything. But like we also wanted to spend some time with Dirty Harry Callahan.
Sure.
Right now, I find that interesting that they were based upon the same outrageous, unorthodox cop. But I mean like Callahan for Clint Eastwood was, he's been around since the early '60s. He was doing westerns, he was doing rawhide, but then he went to become a movie star. But he couldn't become a movie star in America because he was really kind of like a stunt western actor. So he went over to Italy, to work on the Italian westerns, or what became known as the spaghetti westerns. And he just said was the man with no name. So once he built up, a star persona there, he came back, to America, and it's like, well, what's going to be my next role? And like, people kind of like knew him as saying little, but kind of like being dynamic. He's also a man who had a grizzled, face. He wasn't like movie superstar looking kind of guy, but he was somebody you knew not to mess with. I'm choosing my words wisely on that one, So Dirty Harry was a guy you just didn't mess with, and it spawned Dirty Harry spawned like about 4 sequels.
Yeah, right. 4 sequels.
And what I thought was interesting about the Dirty Harry legacy was that here was a guy who created the trope of the partner killer, right? Like nobody could be partners with Dirty Harry because he doesn't give a crack about you. You're gonna get killed, and and so he goes from like the fat like Italian guy who was his partner in the first one to in the subsequent films he would always be given a different ethnicity that he could bounce off with. Like he had the lady cop in the Enforcer, he had the Chinese cop in the pool, Deadpool, I think he had a black cop in Sudden Impact, didn't he? Or was that Thomas Marcelo? Yeah, the black guy. He started out as just kind of like some guy he roughed up in the first film, and then he ended up being like a recurring character. Weirdly, as if maybe all black guys look alike. Who knows? Either way, is Harry carried a big gun, and you don't mess with him, and he had at least one quip. So he also created that whole quip kind of scenario that, you have to give a line before you kill somebody.
Right.
And so in Dirty Harry,
you feel lucky, like, make my day, all that stuff.
Yeah, well, that was Sudden Impact.
But they also think about.
It was man got to know his limitations.
Right.
That was Dirty Harry. But go ahead.
The thing about Dirty Harry is that when the movie came out in '71. And probably shot in late '70, early '71, some of that time period. We were still in the middle of the Vietnam War and all the anti-war protests and the whole counterculture. And his character was a counter to the counterculture. You know what I mean? He was that guy who probably represented a chunk of America that was out there that probably wasn't feeling the counterculture, and so that's why he became such a popular character.
Yeah, because he was like that stick in the mud conservative, like if you go back again, to the '70s, he was kind of like Archie Bunker with a gun.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because he didn't like anybody. So they'll say, hey, look, you don't call Harry a racist. He doesn't like anybody. You know what I mean?
Right.
So in that aspect, it was kind of like saying that, but if anything is, if he's on your tail, you're going to get caught. You know what I mean? Because it's like he's gonna get you. I think that was the main thing.
Let me tell you about some trivia here. That's kind of cool. So the part was actually first offered to John Wayne.
What?
And then he turned it down. Then Sinatra, he turned it down.
Oh,
Robert Mitchum, he turned it down.
I get understand.
Steve McQueen, he turned it down, and Burt Lancaster, then he turned it down.
Wow.
So,
Now those are some power brokers right there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I could see Mitchum more and everything, but did Sinatra do The Detective yet?
he did it in '68 already. So yeah.
Yeah. So okay, I can see why they would kind of think that he could do it. But see, this is like what we said before all the time. I love it when you bring up these alternate castings. It's like there's nobody I could see playing that role. And
Not
when
now.
you name them, yeah, but when you name them, I go, what? You know, my brain is like, it feels like it's on fire. Thinking about that.
And who originally was attached to direct the movie was Irwin Kershner, who eventually directed Empire Strikes Back.
Okay, sorry, yeah.
And then later drafts of the script, there was a draft written by John Milius. There was a draft written by Terrence Malick, but when Clint Eastwood did the movie, he wanted to do the original draft. And the movie was directed by Don Siegel, who, of course...
Well, that's his boy. Don Siegel, is his boy. And, they did a lot of movies together. But Don Siegel also did Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely.
So, he knows how to handle a singular character in a world that he doesn't control, if you look at it like that way. What do you think? What's your favorite one out of the 5? Could you pick one?
Oh, out of the 5 people who would have been cast?
No. Out of the 5 Dirty Harry movies.
Oh, you know what? Here's the funny thing. I just saw the original like 2 weeks ago, but I haven't gone back and rewatched the other 4 in a while.
Man.
But I would just say, but what I love about the original, I'm sure maybe a couple of the sequels too, is that, and it's interesting. I wanted to point this out about Bullitt and Dirty Harry, is the score. Meaning that by Lalo Schifrin, that sort of jazzy score,
he's the man.
That was sort of like of that time and period, that like was only of that time and period, and then later on people just sort of dropped that for a while, But I love the score from because it's so kind of counter to these movies.
Yeah.
Because you're used to your original traditional film score. But as a 5, so I can't make a call on that.
Well, for me, it's The Enforcer with Tyne Daly as his partner, having the lady cop. Because, for one, she's a great actress. And, her trying to keep up with Harry and Hills, that was kind of funny. But also, too, you can see how that led her to Cagney and Lacey. You know what I mean? And stuff, which was kind of like at the forefront of female cop, genres, at the time and stuff like that. But that was good for me. I also like Magnum Force, but hey, what are you gonna do? But but yeah, I just want to say that. But
I kind of remember the last one not being very good.
No, it wasn't. That's why I didn't mean. No, it wasn't. But it was pretty much done by that. It was pretty much done by a sudden impact, to be honest with you. But Deadpool, yeah, no.
Now here's a question. Here's a question to ask you though: are you surprised after all these years that they haven't revived it?
Why would you see? This is the thing. I don't like remakes, but also why would you?
I don't either, but I'm just saying, like.
No. I'm just saying, why would you? Because he is worse than James Bond, right? Harry Callahan is a racist. End of. But the point is, you couldn't help but like him. There was something about him, whether it was the action or whatever.
Well, if they updated him, I'm sure that he would be more like, they wouldn't be.
Well, see, then it's not Dirty Harry then. Because that was the whole point of him being called Dirty Harry, because he had a filthy mouth, he had filthy ideas, and he didn't play by the book, And it's kind of like if you try and remake that, like if you remember, like in the 80s, they tried to do Sledgehammer, that TV show, and everything, which was kind of like a Dirty Harry type of spoof. It just doesn't work, you know what I mean? And it's a product of its time, and that's all I got to say.
Sure.
I'm sure somewhere somebody's thinking about a Dirty Harry remake, but I don't know why they would. Especially while Clint Eastwood is still alive and still doing movies like Gran Torino. You know what I mean?
Sure.
You know, I mean, if anything, you make another Dirty Harry movie where it's like this bastard won't die. But yeah, keep an eye on the time. We got to hit to the French Connection before we got to go. So French Connection, Popeye Doyle. You know, he was based on a real cop, wasn't he?
Yeah, there were two real cops, and there was a real life heroin bust in the 1960s in New York. But again, talking about the casting, before they put in Gene Hackman, because Gene Hackman was well known, but he wasn't a star. This made him a star.
No.
You know, so they had approached, and some of these names you're like, huh? They had approached Paul Newman, kind of makes sense.
Yes.
Jackie Gleason.
No way. Jackie Gleason's never lost weight since the honeymoon, so I don't even know why that would be the case.
Peter Boyle, which I could kind of see in a way. You know,
tough guy at that time, yeah.
Steve McQueen, which makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Charles Bronson, which kind of makes sense.
Definitely
and then here's an oddball one. Rod Taylor, you know, from the Time Machine.
Yeah. Well, it's not an oddball. I mean, I just saw The Birds the other night, so I could dig it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's interesting again, looking this sort of casting history and seeing like, oh well, what would this movie be like if it was with any of these guys? I mean, Jackie Gleason's ridiculous, but you know,
that's a ridiculous casting, that one. I mean, like Charles Bronson, he probably had already done Death Wish, or had he not done Death Wish by then?
No, he had. Death Wish was like 3 years later.
Okay, you know, but I mean, like either way. Oh well, you know, Charles Bronson is the only person I could see then giving him a run for his money. You know, I mean, like to think about it is. It's costume is everything as well, you know, with these characters. And I mean, Gene Hackman worked that hat.
Sure.
You know, and it's funny how like he did this at the same time he was doing the Poseidon Adventure. Do you know what I mean? So you say that he wasn't a big star, but he was a known star.
Right.
You know, but this was a defining role for him.
But all three of these guys, and I think it was again a symbol of the times, is that they weren't like your traditional handsome leading men. They weren't pretty boys. You know what I mean?
No.
They, you know, but they all became huge stars and probably sex symbols on one level or another. You know what I mean?
Well, I think what you got to look at it is action makes people sexy. I mean, like the deal is that they were all everymen, right? So they weren't intimidating in any kind of way, but they also didn't play it like, hey, I'm Lover Man, like I'm Superfly or I'm James Bond. They didn't have to do any of that kind of stuff. You know, I mean, so if anything, they were the quintessential hard-boiled guys, you know, and the hard-boiled guys are the ones that both men and women like, you know, so because they like them, that there's something about them, that there's that air about them, and all three characters had that, you know, and everything. And, you know, was he also in the French Connection too? Because I know there was a second one. Was Gene Hackman in the second one?
I think he was, yeah. But then there was that TV movie then in the 80s where he was played by Ed O'Neill.
Well, you know, yeah, I was going to say that Ed O'Neill. I watched that. I loved that. It was like the Papa Doyle thing and stuff like that. You know, so, yeah, no, it was great. But also, too, is I loved how it was like shot in the underground, like you were talking about the elevated train systems or even on the train platforms themselves. You know, it showed the city, and you know, for its true grit, so to speak. Yeah, and I think that was really good in that aspect.
And it's the kind of New York City I think you and I grew up in. You know that.
Hell yeah!
It was a much grittier New York City that kind of doesn't really exist anymore. You know, or at least in a lot of parts.
No.
You know, and so it's like you try to recreate it, but it's sort of like, you know, like that was, you know, people don't realize that New York City, especially by the early 70s, had really hit the skids, you know? You know, so it's like, you know, I think it captures it beautifully.
But also, too, is these films are kind of like the first within the genre. So the genre is expanding and growing, and everything else copies these films. So that's why it's really cool that we had picked these films to look at.
And I just want
everything else just kind of like, you know, a comparison.
I also want to touch before we go, of course, that this film was directed by William Friedkin, who his next film was The Exorcist. And wow. I've always found it interesting that like William Friedkin, like Peter Bogdanovich, like from the early 70s, that these two particular directors had these sort of very short window of amazing careers of critical and popular success at the same time, but then they never were able to really achieve that level of success again.
Like the longevity of it. I mean,
Yeah,
I think it's lightning in a bottle, bruv. I think it's like you
sure.
got a combination of actor and director, and concept that is working well together, and it's hard to repeat that. A lot of people think it's, oh well, I'll just go on to the next one. Like when we were working in music videos, oh, I'll just go on to the next one and I'll just do the next one. And a film, it's like Sanskrit. You know what I mean? It's like you get it right. It's very hard to repeat it. That's why sequels don't work. Remakes definitely don't work. But like, so those combinations of people that we just mentioned,
And it's
really put
interesting
it all together.
And it's interesting, one more comment, that the producer of Bullitt and the French Connection, Philip D'Antonio, went on to make the 7-Ups. That was his first film he directed. And he, of course, had to do another car chase because it worked so well.
Roy Steiner, man, that car chase under the L is phenomenal. And everything, and visceral, especially when the car crashes into the truck. But we got to go. So, like, either way is, first of all, once again, we wanted to thank Lucy Pickavans for suggesting
Thank you, Lucy.
levels of films. And please, if anybody else has any ideas, we would really love to go take a deep dive into them. I mean, please suggest Sword and Sorcery so I can convince Dan to go look at something.
I'll do it.
But also like and subscribe, because we are enjoying this, and hopefully you're enjoying the deep dive into these films and everything. And it only works if you're working with us. So I want to thank Dan Hopper for joining me.
Thanks.
I'm Chase Johnson Lynch, and we also want to give a big thanks to our man in the booth, Blake, and everything like that.
All right, Blake.
Yes, right. So you've been watching Big Condo Radio, and you've been watching The Essentials. Close the book now. I don't know. I got to come up with a line at end these shows. But we out of here.